My name is Claire Bennett. I am 36 years old. And the day my husband looked at me across a courtroom and laughed, I let him. I wanted him to laugh. I needed him to feel safe one more time before the floor disappeared under him. For 9 years, I played the role of the tired stay-at-home wife of a man everyone in Charleston admired. Daniel Bennett ran a private wealth management firm that handled money for half the old families in South Carolina. He told his friends I used to work in customer service before we married and that I had happily stepped back to raise our son. He believed I spent my days doing school pickups, folding laundry, and posting recipes online. He had no idea that before I met him, I spent 6 years as a federal financial crimes investigator, and that for the last 3 years of our marriage, I had been quietly consulting for the very regulators who were building a case against firms exactly like his. Before I tell you how I let him walk straight into his own downfall, tell me one thing. Have you ever smiled at someone while already knowing exactly how their story ends? If you have, hit that like button, because tonight's story is for you. It started on a warm Thursday evening in April, the night before our son's spring recital. I came home early to help him with his tie, and the house was too quiet. I found Daniel in his study, already dressed for a dinner I hadn't been told about, a suitcase by the door. On the desk sat a folder with my name on it. Not a note, a folder. He didn't even look up when I walked in. "We need to talk," he said, the same flat tone he used with clients he was about to drop. "I've filed. My lawyer has the papers ready. You'll get a courtesy copy tomorrow." I asked him why. He finally looked at me, and there was nothing in his eyes that resembled 9 years of marriage. "I've met someone who actually understands my world," he said. "Someone who can stand next to me at galas and boardrooms, not someone who disappeared into diaper bags and grocery runs." I asked what that made me. He shrugged. "A very comfortable chapter that's closing." I looked at the folder on the desk. He had already listed our house, our accounts, even the small trust I had set up for our son, all under his sole control. He told me not to bother fighting it. "You don't have the money for a real lawyer," he said, almost gently, like he was doing me a favor by warning me. "And even if you did, you don't have the first idea how any of this works." I thought about the years I had spent tracing hidden accounts for the Treasury Department before I ever met him. I said nothing. He told me I had 1 week to find somewhere else to live. He said it like he was announcing a schedule change at the office. Calm, final. Already moved on. I asked about our son. "He'll be fine," Daniel said. "Kids adjust." I asked about the money I had put into the house 5 years earlier, money from my own savings, back when I still had a career he never fully understood. He laughed, actually laughed, and told me the deed was in his name only, and that was the end of that conversation. "I want you to understand something about me before we go further. I do not raise my voice when I am angry. I get quiet. I get precise. The angrier I am, the calmer I sound, because that is exactly how I was trained to sound when I was building a case against men who thought they were untouchable." Daniel mistook my silence for defeat. It was not defeat. It was the sound of a door closing on him, very slowly, very carefully, so he would never hear it shut until it was too late. 2 days later, his mother invited me to what she called a family conversation at her lake house. I almost didn't go. I went anyway, because I wanted to see exactly how far this family thought they could push me, and because I wanted to know who else was standing behind Daniel while he burned our life down. I wore an old cardigan and flat shoes. I looked exactly like a woman who had just been left with nothing. That was the point. When I walked into that house, his mother, Patricia, was seated at the head of the table like a queen holding court. Daniel's sister was there too, along with a woman I had never met, young, polished, wearing a bracelet I recognized because I had seen its price tag in Daniel's card statements months earlier. Nobody stood up. Nobody offered me a seat. Patricia looked me over slowly and said the words I will never forget as long as I live. "We always wondered what he saw in you. Now we finally get our answer." Absolutely nothing. The table laughed. Daniel didn't stop them. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, enjoying the show like it was entertainment he had personally arranged. I stood there in my old cardigan, letting them believe every cruel word landed exactly where they wanted it to. What none of them knew, what none of them could possibly have imagined, was that the quiet woman standing in that doorway already had a federal case file open with Daniel Bennett's name on the very first page. And in less than 3 weeks, every single person laughing at that table was going to be sitting in a courtroom, watching me walk in without a lawyer, and wondering how they ever underestimated me this badly. Patricia wasn't finished. She leaned forward, rings catching the light, and told me that a real lawyer would cost more than I would ever see in a year. She said Daniel had already spoken to Holbrook and Reyes, the most aggressive divorce firm in the state, and that they didn't lose. She said I should sign whatever Daniel put in front of me and disappear quietly for our son's sake before I embarrassed myself in public. I let her finish every word. I wanted her comfortable. Comfortable people talk too much, and talking too much is how cases get built. Before I left the lake house that night, Daniel's sister-in-law, Renee, followed me out to my car. She had married into this family 5 years earlier and looked permanently exhausted by it. She lit a cigarette with shaking hands and told me something Daniel never meant for anyone to hear. She said Daniel and his new partner in the firm, a man named Victor, had been moving client retirement funds into shell investments for over a year, funds belonging to elderly clients who trusted Daniel with everything they had. She said she only knew because Daniel's brother handled the firm's internal transfers and had been drinking too much and talking too loud at family dinners. She said she was terrified because her own name was on some of the paperwork, filed without her real understanding of what she was signing. She asked me why I wasn't panicking. I told her I would take care of it. She had no idea what those 5 words actually meant coming from me. The next morning, I called a number I hadn't used in 3 years. My former supervisor at the regulatory division answered on the second ring and didn't sound surprised to hear from me. I told her what Renee had described. She told me the division already had irregular activity flagged on Daniel's firm, but no one on the inside willing to confirm it with real documentation. I told her I could get inside access no one would ever suspect, because no one in that family had ever once asked what I actually did with my time before I became, in their eyes, just Daniel's forgotten wife. Over the next 2 weeks, while Daniel believed I was quietly packing boxes and crying myself to sleep, I was working with investigators every single night after our son fell asleep. I still smiled at school pickup. I still answered Daniel's texts about furniture and moving dates in short, defeated sentences, exactly the tone he expected from a woman he thought he had already broken. Meanwhile, financial records were being pulled, client statements were being cross-checked, and a picture was forming that went far beyond a messy divorce. Daniel wasn't just abandoning his family. He was running a fraud that had already stolen retirement savings from people who trusted him with their entire futures. 10 days before our court date, Daniel served me with what his lawyer called a full and final settlement, giving him the house, the accounts, and primary control of our son's trust, while offering me a payment that wouldn't have covered 6 months of rent. His lawyer told me, almost kindly, that I should take it, because once we stepped into that courtroom, things would only get worse for me. I signed nothing. I told them I needed a few more days to think. What I actually needed was 1 more week for federal investigators to finish building an airtight case, using records I had personally helped trace back to accounts Daniel believed no one would ever find. On the morning of our court date, I walked into that building alone, no lawyer beside me, wearing the same tired cardigan Patricia had mocked at her lake house. Daniel was already seated with his attorney, sharp suit, easy smile, the same expression he wore the night he told me our marriage was a comfortable chapter closing. When he saw me walk in without representation, he actually laughed out loud, loud enough that the judge glanced up from her papers. His lawyer leaned over and whispered something that made Daniel laugh again. He believed, completely, that this would be over in 20 minutes. The judge called the case and asked if I had counsel present. I said no, Your Honor, I am representing myself. Daniel's attorney barely hid his smile as he stood and began describing me exactly the way Patricia had, a woman with no resources, no career, no case, simply here to be reasonable and sign what was already prepared. I let him talk. I let him build his own confidence into a wall he had no idea was about to come down on him. When it was my turn, I stood and asked the judge for permission to introduce evidence that had, that very morning, been formally filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission and forwarded to this court as relevant to asset disclosure. I watched Daniel's smile freeze. His attorney turned to him with a confused frown. I explained, calmly, that the accounts Daniel claimed as separate property, the ones his lawyer had listed as solely his, had in fact been used to receive and redirect client funds that were currently under active federal investigation, meaning those accounts could not simply be awarded to him in a divorce settlement because they were about to be frozen entirely. The courtroom went silent. Daniel's attorney asked to see documentation. I handed the clerk a sealed federal filing, and the judge's eyes moved across the page slowly, then lifted to look directly at Daniel's lawyer, and then, finally, at me. She asked how a woman with no listed occupation on her own financial disclosure had access to sealed federal investigative material. I told her the truth, that I had spent 6 years as a federal financial crimes investigator before my marriage, that I had continued consulting quietly for the last 3 years of it, and that I was the analyst who had personally traced the funds now under investigation. The judge looked past me, straight at Daniel's attorney, and asked the question that ended everything. You don't recognize her? Daniel's face went the color of paper. His attorney's confident posture collapsed into something small and uncertain. Patricia, seated in the gallery in her pearls, gripped the bench in front of her like it might steady the ground beneath her. Within the hour, the accounts Daniel believed were untouchable were frozen under federal order. Within the month, he was formally charged, along with his business partner, for defrauding dozens of clients out of their retirement savings, and the very sister-in-law who once trembled outside a lake house became a key witness who helped prove it all. I walked out of that courthouse with full custody of our son, a house that was legally mine, and a family who had once laughed at a woman in an old cardigan, now watching the news and realizing that the quiet, forgotten wife they mocked was the same person who had taken everything Daniel thought he'd already won. He underestimated my silence. He mistook my patience for weakness. And in the end, that single mistake cost him everything he ever built. If you have ever been underestimated by someone who thought your silence meant surrender, tell me in the comments, because sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who was watching the whole time.